Moving into a new apartment had always been on Emily's list of fresh starts. She had left her old life and city behind, packed up her things, and drove to a quiet town that was supposed to be her escape. Her new apartment was in an old brick building on the edge of town, with vines creeping up its sides and windows framed by thick, chipped paint. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, seemed happy enough to have someone finally move in after years of vacancy. The apartment had a strange layout. The living room stretched long and narrow, with faded wallpaper that looked like it had been there for decades. The single bedroom faced the courtyard, where a few dead plants sat in cracked pots. Her first night, she noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, like something damp or musty. She tried airing out the room, but it lingered. The smell got worse on the second night. When she pressed her ear to the wall, she could almost hear a faint scratching sound. She dismissed it as pipes or maybe a mouse, and by morning it was gone. That evening, as she settled in with a book, she heard a series of creaks. Not uncommon in old buildings, she told herself, ignoring the shiver up her spine. But the creaks turned into footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth in the apartment above her. She hadn't seen any other tenants moving in, and Mr. Whitaker had assured her that all the other units were empty. Still, she tried to ignore it. By the third night, the smell was unbearable, like something decaying just beneath her floorboards. She tried calling Mr. Whitaker to ask if maybe an animal had died somewhere in the building, but he didn't pick up. Her phone calls went straight to voicemail. As she lay in bed, a cold draft rolled through her room. Her eyes flicked to the window. It was tightly shut. She closed her eyes, pulling the blanket up over her head, hoping to drift off despite the scent. A sudden banging on the walls made her jump. It started in the kitchen and echoed through the living room, like someone slamming their fists against the walls. She got up, her heart racing, and flicked on the lights, but the noise stopped as quickly as it had started. She tiptoed to the kitchen, holding her breath. Nothing was out of place. The banging resumed just as she reached her bedroom door. This time, it was louder and more desperate, as if someone or something was trying to break through. She locked her bedroom door and sat against it, listening to the relentless noise. It stopped around 3 a.m. She heard footsteps again above her, this time dragging slowly, in a rhythm that didn't sound human. She stayed awake until sunrise, her back pressed against the door, listening to the faint shuffling. She tried calling Mr. Whitaker again, and this time he answered, sounding annoyed. "There's a smell in the apartment, Mr. Whitaker. It's getting worse," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll look into it," he said curtly, then hung up. He didn't show up that day, and Emily felt trapped, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. That night, as she lay in bed, the smell turned putrid, and she felt something tickling her arm. She jerked up, turning on the bedside lamp, only to see black mold creeping up the walls, spreading like veins. It pulsed as if alive, and a cold breeze wafted through the room. She watched in horror as the mold seemed to form shapes, faces distorted and screaming, with hollow eyes and mouths twisted in agony. She backed out of the room, trying to catch her breath, only to hear a whisper. "Help us!" The voice was weak, barely audible, but she knew it came from the walls. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, but the battery was dead. She sprinted to the door, yanking at the lock, but it wouldn't budge. Something had jammed it. Her heart pounded as she heard footsteps again above her, closer this time, as if descending from the ceiling. "Let me out!" she screamed, banging on the door. The footsteps stopped, and there was a silence so complete she could hear her own ragged breathing. She looked back at her bedroom door, which was slowly creaking open. Inside, the black mold had spread across the walls and ceiling, forming a dark, pulsating mass. A figure stood in the corner, just barely visible, its face hidden in shadow. She could make out thin, bony arms and long fingers that stretched toward her, beckoning. "Please, help us." The voice was louder now, echoing through the apartment. She realized it wasn't a single voice. It was multiple voices, layered over each other in a twisted harmony of suffering. She took a step back, tripping over her own feet, and fell to the floor. As she scrambled to get up, she felt something cold grab her ankle, pulling her towards the bedroom. She kicked and struggled, but the grip was relentless. She was dragged across the floor, her nails scraping against the wood, leaving trails as she clawed for freedom. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice breaking. She was pulled into the room, and the door slammed shut. She was surrounded by darkness, the smell overwhelming as the figure loomed closer. She tried to scream, but the air was thick, pressing against her chest. She could barely breathe. The last thing she saw was the figure's face, twisted and decayed, leaning down to her. Its hollow eyes stared into hers, and it opened its mouth, releasing a low, guttural sound that echoed through the apartment. The next morning, Mr. Whitaker went to check on the unit, as he'd been avoiding Emily's calls for days. When he opened the door, there was no sign of her. The apartment was quiet, the walls freshly painted, no smell, no mold, everything was as it had been. Yet, if anyone listened closely, sometimes late at night they'd hear faint footsteps and the sound of whispers from the walls. And somewhere, deep within the building, Emily's voice echoed, calling out, begging, "Help us." The house was exactly what they'd been looking for, tucked away from the main road, with a sprawling yard and a porch that wrapped around like a big, welcoming hug. The house itself was old, built in the late 1800s, but recently renovated. Claire and Ben thought they'd scored the deal of a lifetime when they signed the lease, but there was a condition. The landlord mentioned a small locked room on the second floor that couldn't be opened. "It's an old storage closet. We lost the key ages ago," he had said. "There's nothing in there. Just pretend it doesn't exist." They found it a little odd, but they shrugged it off. After all, the house was perfect. On move-in day, Claire was busy unpacking while Ben ran to the store for a few last-minute things. She was alone in the house when she first heard it, a faint tapping sound from the direction of the locked room. She paused, trying to brush it off as house-settling noises. But as the tapping persisted, she found herself growing uneasy. She went upstairs to investigate, standing outside the door to the locked room. She pressed her ear against it, holding her breath. Silence. She took a step back, shaking her head. It was nothing, just nerves, she told herself. But later that night, as she and Ben were getting ready for bed, they both heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the second floor. Ben looked at her, eyebrows raised. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, swallowing hard. Together, they crept up the stairs, their footsteps soft on the old wooden floor. When they reached the landing, the shuffling stopped. They exchanged a nervous glance before heading back down, chalking it up to their imaginations. The next few nights, things only got worse. They'd wake up in the middle of the night to faint whispers. Sometimes, Claire would catch a shadow flitting just out of sight in her peripheral vision. But when she turned, there was nothing there. They began to feel watched, as if the house itself were observing them. The air grew thick, the atmosphere heavy with a feeling of dread neither could explain. One evening, while Ben was in the yard, Claire decided to go upstairs to get to the bottom of the noises. She approached the locked door, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried the handle, still locked, of course. But then she felt something odd. The doorknob was ice cold, and as she leaned in, she heard a voice whisper her name. "Claire?" She stumbled back, her blood running cold. She ran outside to tell Ben, but he just laughed it off, suggesting they might be imagining things after hearing about the locked room. They tried to ignore the happenings, but things only escalated. A week later, they woke up to find that the furniture in the living room had been rearranged during the night. The coffee table was upside down, the chairs facing the walls, and the television had been unplugged. They hadn't heard a sound. Claire began to suspect that whatever was happening was connected to that locked room. Desperate, she searched online for any history of the house. She found an old newspaper article detailing a series of disappearances tied to the property. The article mentioned a family who had lived there in the early 1900s, a mother and her 3 children. They had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an empty, locked room. Claire felt a chill as she read about rumors that the mother had been disturbed, convinced that the house held spirits that whispered to her every night. After that, Claire couldn't sleep, hearing faint footsteps every time she closed her eyes. Ben, too, began to see things, a pale face in the bathroom mirror, shadowy figures in the corners of the rooms. They'd find strange marks on the walls, scratches and symbols that seemed to appear overnight. The house seemed to grow colder with each passing day, and the smell of something rotten began to seep from the walls. Finally, one night, Claire had enough. She went upstairs with a crowbar, determined to pry open the door. Ben tried to stop her, but she was beyond reason. The whispers had grown louder, almost frantic, as if they sensed her plan. She forced the crowbar between the door and the frame, grunting as she pried. The door burst open with a loud crack, and she stumbled inside, clutching a flashlight. The room was small, barely a closet, but the walls were covered in writing, scratched deeply into the wood. The words repeated over and over in a frantic scrawl, "Let us out!" In the center of the floor was a worn, old doll, its face cracked, eyes dark and hollow. She turned to leave, only to find the door had swung shut. She lunged for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the air grew thick, and she felt an icy hand graze the back of her neck. She screamed for Ben, but her voice seemed to vanish into the darkness. Outside the room, Ben heard nothing. He searched the house, calling her name, but there was no trace of Claire. She was gone, as if she had never been there. Days later, the landlord arrived to check on them after they missed their rent payment. He found the house empty, except for one thing: the locked door on the second floor, firmly shut once again. And if anyone put their ear to it, they could hear a faint scratching sound, like someone trapped inside. And if they listened even closer, they'd hear a whisper, "Help us." When Nate and Sarah moved into their new rental, it was supposed to be a fresh start. They had left the chaos of city life behind and found a small, picturesque farmhouse far from the crowds. It was a place where they could finally relax and build the life they'd dreamed of. The house was beautiful in an old, eerie way. Wooden floors that creaked underfoot, big, foggy windows that looked out over sprawling fields, and an attic that hadn't been touched in years. From the first night, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just an unsettling feeling. Shadows seemed longer than they should have been, and certain corners of the house felt colder, like they hadn't seen sunlight in ages. Nate shrugged it off as the quirks of an old home, but Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that they weren't alone. It began with the radio. Every night at exactly 3:15 a.m., they'd wake up to hear faint, crackling music coming from the living room. It sounded like an old jazz tune, something from the 1920s. The first time it happened, Nate went downstairs to find the radio already on, though neither of them had turned it on that day. He turned it off, thinking maybe it was just an old circuit acting up. But every night, like clockwork, the radio would come on, playing that same haunting melody, filling the house with a tinny, ghostly tune. Then Sarah started hearing footsteps in the attic. Late at night, when everything was still, she'd hear a slow, deliberate pacing above their bedroom. It sounded like heavy boots, each step sending a dull thud through the ceiling. When she mentioned it to Nate, he laughed it off, saying it was probably just squirrels or raccoons. But when he heard it himself a few nights later, his face went pale. The footsteps were too heavy, too measured to belong to any animal. One afternoon, Sarah decided to go up to the attic to check for any signs of rodents. She pulled down the ladder and climbed up, her flashlight cutting through the thick dust that hung in the air. The attic was bare, just a few forgotten pieces of furniture draped in white sheets. But something caught her eye in the corner, a small trunk covered in dust and tucked away as if someone wanted it forgotten. Curious, she knelt beside it and opened the latch. Inside, she found old, brittle photographs, all black and white, showing the farmhouse as it was decades ago. The faces in the photos stared back at her, smiling in that unsettling way that old photographs seemed to capture. But what really caught her attention was a single photograph of a man and woman, both dressed in their Sunday best, standing on the front porch of her house. The woman looked like her, almost exactly. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the shape of her nose and the shade of her hair. Unnerved, she closed the trunk and hurried back downstairs. She told Nate about the photo, but he tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just a coincidence. Still, he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. That night, as they lay in bed, the footsteps started again, heavier this time, pacing back and forth above them. They held each other, listening, as the pacing grew louder. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence was thick and suffocating. And then they heard a voice. "Where's my wife?" A deep, guttural whisper echoed through the house. Nate and Sarah sat up, their hearts pounding. The voice sounded close, too close, as if it were just outside their door. Sarah whispered to Nate that they should leave, but he was frozen, staring at the door, his face white with fear. The voice came again, louder this time. Where's my wife?" A chill spread through the room, and Sarah felt a sudden sharp pressure on her shoulder, as if an icy hand had gripped her. She cried out, swatting at her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nate grabbed her hand, pulling her up. They rushed down the stairs, stumbling over each other in their panic, and bolted for the door. But just as Nate reached for the doorknob, it twisted in his hand and the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. In the darkness, the house seemed to come alive around them. Shadows danced along the walls, growing larger and darker, almost tangible. The coldness intensified, and that same jazz tune started playing, this time louder, echoing through the house. It felt as if the walls were pulsing, breathing, closing in on them. Desperate, Nate tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. Sarah clutched his arm, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Nate, he's looking for me. He thinks I'm her." Nate shook his head, not wanting to believe it, but deep down he knew she was right. The resemblance in the photograph, the voice, the hand on her shoulder, it was all connected. The voice came again, this time from right behind them. "Where is my wife?" They turned, but there was no one there. Just shadows stretching along the walls, swirling around them, drawing closer. The temperature dropped further, and they could see their breath fogging in the cold air. Suddenly, Sarah felt herself being pulled backward, an invisible force yanking her toward the stairs. She screamed, reaching for Nate, who tried to hold on to her, but something was too strong. He stumbled after her, struggling to keep hold of her hand. She felt an overwhelming urge to go back up to the attic, like she had no control over her own legs. "Sarah, fight it!" Nate yelled, but his voice sounded distant, as if the house itself were muffling him. She felt her vision darkening, her head growing foggy, and all she could hear was that voice, whispering in her ear, urging her to go to the attic, telling her to stay, to be with him. At the top of the stairs, she felt herself slipping, falling, the world around her fading. She heard Nate calling her name, but he sounded miles away. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the attic, standing in the center of the room. The shadows were thicker here, swirling around her like smoke. And then she saw him, a figure standing just a few feet away, his face pale and twisted, eyes dark with rage. "You're mine," he said, reaching out a hand. She screamed, backing away, but he followed, his cold gaze fixed on her. She felt a hand close around her wrist, pulling her back toward the darkness. "No, she's mine!" Nate's voice cut through the silence, and suddenly the cold released her. She stumbled backward, her vision clearing, and saw Nate standing in the doorway, his face filled with terror. They bolted out of the attic, down the stairs, and finally out of the house, gasping for breath in the open air. Behind them, the house seemed to settle, the shadows pulling back, the silence thick and menacing. They left everything behind that night, driving away without a backward glance. They never returned, and the house sat empty for years, waiting for someone new to claim as its own. Rachel and Tom were thrilled to find the house. It was an old, charming Victorian with tall windows, a steeply gabled roof, and an ornate wraparound porch. The place was perfect, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, and best of all, it came at a bargain price. Their new home came with a history, the realtor admitted, a tragic one. The original owners had lost a child there, a little girl who had fallen down the main staircase. It was rumored that the family left soon after, unable to bear the memories, but over the years, several others had come and gone. Rachel, a firm skeptic of the supernatural, brushed off the stories, chalking them up to small-town gossip. Tom was more superstitious, but with Rachel's reassurances, he quickly grew comfortable in the house. They spent their first night curled up together in the living room, laughing at the creaks and groans of their new home. But things quickly took a strange turn. On their second night, they were lying in bed when they heard a faint giggle echo down the hall. It was high-pitched, like a child's laughter, but soft and distant. Tom sat up, eyes wide, but Rachel shook her head. "It's just the house settling," she said, hoping her own voice didn't betray her unease. They lay back down, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was in the house with them. The laughter came again, and this time Rachel heard it clearly. It was faint but unmistakable. Her heart began to race, and she gripped Tom's hand. They both lay still, listening, but after a few moments the laughter stopped. They fell asleep eventually, though it was a restless night for them both. The following morning, Rachel found small footprints in the dust near the top of the staircase. The prints were tiny, as if left by a child. She called Tom over, but by the time he arrived, she'd almost convinced herself it was just her imagination. She cleaned them up, pushing away the memory of the little girl who had supposedly fallen to her death. Over the next few days, things grew stranger. Rachel would hear footsteps padding softly down the hallway in the early hours of the morning. Sometimes she'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye, a flash of white, a flicker of long hair. But when she turned, there was no one there. One night she was woken by the feeling of a cold hand brushing against her cheek. Her eyes shot open, and she saw the faint outline of a little girl standing beside her bed. The girl's face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, and her hair hung limp around her shoulders. Rachel's throat tightened in fear, but she couldn't move, paralyzed by the intensity of the girl's gaze. "Will you play with me?" the girl whispered, her voice barely audible, but it rang clear in Rachel's mind. Rachel blinked, and the girl was gone. She sat up, gasping, her heart pounding. Tom stirred beside her, mumbling sleepily, but she didn't dare tell him what she'd seen. She spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the door, listening to the soft creaks and whispers that seemed to echo through the house. The next day, Tom suggested they take a break and spend the evening in town. He had been hearing noises too, strange sounds that followed him from room to room, cold spots that seemed to drift through the house, and once he could have sworn he heard his name whispered from the empty hallway. They stayed out late that night, not returning until well after dark. As they stepped inside, they noticed that something felt wrong. The house was colder than usual, the air thick and heavy, almost suffocating. The lights flickered as they made their way upstairs, and Rachel's unease grew with each step. When they reached the bedroom, they found the walls covered in tiny handprints, smeared across the wallpaper in pale, ghostly outlines. The handprints circled the room, as if a child had been running her fingers along the walls, leaving a trail behind her. Tom stared, his face pale, while Rachel struggled to catch her breath. Then they heard it again. The giggle, high and soft, echoing from the hallway just outside their room. The doorknob rattled, and Rachel grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him close. They watched as the knob twisted slowly, as if someone were trying to open the door. Rachel stumbled backward, heart racing, and Tom took a step toward the door, reaching out a shaky hand to grip the knob. He pulled it open, and there was nothing there, just the empty, dark hallway stretching out before them. But the laughter came again, closer this time, as if it were right beside them. They slammed the door shut, locking it, and spent the rest of the night huddled together, too terrified to move. By morning, the handprints had vanished from the walls, and the house felt almost normal again. But it wasn't over. That evening, while Rachel was in the kitchen, she heard the sound of a ball bouncing down the stairs. She froze, turning slowly, and watched as a small, dusty rubber ball rolled to a stop at her feet. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and heard the voice again, whispering softly in her ear. "Will you play with me?" She dropped the ball, stumbling back, and found herself face to face with the little girl. The child looked up at her, her eyes empty and cold, her face pale as death. Her mouth curved into a slight sad smile as she held out a small, icy hand. Rachel backed away, but the girl followed, her hand reaching out, her voice growing louder. "Why won't you play with me?" Rachel screamed, running up the stairs, but the girl's footsteps followed, tapping softly against the floor, echoing through the house. Tom came running, but he stopped short when he saw the girl, his eyes widening in terror. They watched in horror as she tilted her head, her eyes locked onto Rachel. "You're not my mommy," the girl said, her voice filled with anger and confusion. "Where is my mommy?" Rachel's heart broke at the pain in the girl's voice, but the fear was overwhelming. She grabbed Tom's hand, pulling him down the stairs, their footsteps pounding as they fled from the house, the girl's cries echoing behind them. They left that night, abandoning the house, leaving everything behind. They never returned, and the house has remained empty ever since. But those who pass by say they can still hear the faint sound of a little girl's laughter, echoing through the empty rooms, waiting for someone new to play with her.